Hello everyone, and welcome to Season 2 of Reinforcement Talking. My name's Charlie, and I'm going to be one of your co-hosts for today's episode. I'm a second year PPE student at UCL, and also a member of the UCL AI Society. I'm really glad to be here with another co-host for today's episode. So John, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes. Hello, my name is John Hoteen. I'm the president of Amnesty International Society at UCL. I'm a second year arts and sciences student. And I'm really looking forward to the podcast.
Nice, thanks for that, John. Well, I'm really excited today that we're joined with Rianna Nayee. Rianna works as Campaigns and Policy Officer at the United Nations Association UK, an organisation which works on UN reform. UNA UK works mainly on issues relating to human rights and security, and is a member of the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots, an international coalition of NGOs calling for a preemptive ban on lethal autonomous weapons, as we're going to be speaking more about in today's episode. Rianna first joined UNA UK as a volunteer in 2019 and joined the communications team in 2020. She holds a degree in classical archaeology and ancient history from the University of Oxford. Rianna, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Charlie. Thanks both. It's great to be here with you.
Okay, nice. Well, my rough plan for today's conversation is that the first half, with me, we're going to be speaking about what autonomous weapon systems are and what the moral case against them is. And then in the second half of the conversation, we're going to be moving into more practical and policy questions with John about how we can influence change on the UN level, the UK level, and even a university level. This first question, what are killer robots, and how can we define autonomous weapon systems?
So, autonomous weapon systems, and specifically lethal autonomous weapon systems, are what we call killer robots. And we call that because that's essentially what they are. They are weapons that would be able to select and engage targets without any meaningful human control. It is worth noting that the international community has yet to agree on a singular definition of lethal autonomous weapon system. So that is sort of up for debate at the moment. But what we do know is enabling robotic weapons to be able to choose and fire on targets on their own without any human intervention would pose a fundamental challenge to the protection of civilians and to compliance with international law. And that would include kind of international human rights law and humanitarian law. So the scope of the weapons that the campaign is specifically looking at, it should be understood as those that select and engage lethal force. Essentially what they would do is use sensor inputs and match that to the target profile, and then without any human intervention they would launch. So following their activation or launch there wouldn't be human intervention, and those would be able to then use lethal force.
Right.
And so that's the position of both the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots and also the international, so ICRC, the Red Cross.
Yeah, I think this sounds like, from what I can gather about this debate, it seems like sometimes people talk past each other when they're trying to define lethal autonomous weapon systems. And you have what it seems like slightly bad faith definitions, like a system's got to be like human level intelligence, or we've had another view might be we've had autonomous weapon systems since World War II, since sort of honing munitions or something. Do you feel like these definitional problems are sort of masking other disagreements or something?
I don't think they are masking anything, but I think it's just an inherent thing to when you're trying to define something that is. This is creating a seismic shift, right? So there are differences when you reference kind of torpedoes and kind of weapons that were used in World War II. The ability that they had is obviously what we're dealing with now is already miles away from that. And so the key difference is the extent to which a human is involved. But that doesn't mean that we're saying we're fine with weapons that have a degree of autonomy. So a lot of these kind of fire and forget systems that were used in World War II and continue to be used today are problematic for various reasons. But the campaign to stop killer robots is focusing on this particular phenomenon, which is substantively different to those type of systems. So the key difference is that fire and forget weapons are launched by a human user, and that human has been able to use their judgment to determine the existence of a target and the decision to use lethal force against it. So with a killer robot, the target is not identified or selected by a human. This step is first taken by a computer, and then without any subsequent human interaction, that computer instructs a weapon system to use lethal force. So that is, as you can imagine, so beyond anything that we were dealing with up until now.
Right.
And so while there are similarities between anti-personnel landmines, for example, the behavior of these emergent killer robots is the ability to operate over vast geographical areas for long periods of time. So the chaos that this will bring forward, it raises massive questions in terms of operations problems, machine learning. There's the risk of biases and discrimination and lack of accountability, and the scope of this is so much larger than the error that is inherent with a human deciding to begin that launch. When you're raising the example of torpedoes in World War II, for example, but even today. So these are kind of what many view as insurmountable technical challenges. That's what we would be dealing with killer robots. IHL scholars will also explain why weapons with such behaviours cannot comply with the laws of armed conflict. So already, while there is this debate about the close definition of killer robots, of autonomous weapon systems, what I would argue isn't up for debate is that these weapons are already at odds with international law.
Right. Yeah, thank you for that. I think we'll come back to like those moral problems over the course of this conversation, but I guess like a good question to sort of, for context here, is like, what's the current state of play of the development and deployment of these weapons internationally?
Yeah, that's a really important question. So what we do know is the precursors to killer robots. So we're talking armed drones. They're currently being developed and deployed by a number of nations. So that includes China, Israel, South Korea, Russia, Australia, India, Turkey, the UK significantly, and the United States. So one thing to note is the global use of AI is escalating. And so specifically, there is an increased application of military AI and other advanced tech in conflict. And as is often the case, there is then the risk of an arms race, right? And specifically with this tech, it's moving so rapidly that this is kind of the crux of the matter for the campaign to stop killer robots, is we need to be able to legislate in advance of this escalating any further. But in terms of examples of this military application, we're already seeing it. It's not what we can necessarily define as killer robots, but it is very much getting to, an alarming point of involvement of AI that has really frightening knock-on effects. So this includes, but isn't limited to, reports of AI use in Ukraine, Facebook's algorithms creating hate speech during Ethiopia's Tigray civil war, and voice cloning in Sudan civil war, all of which directly contribute to violence and our tech that can be used for target manipulation by weapon systems. And as I kind of mentioned earlier, the Israeli military has been increasingly integrating AI into its planning, its surveillance and weapon systems. And currently we are seeing it used in Gaza as a test subject. So this is something that the UK campaign to stop killer robots is deeply alarmed by. And as we record this conversation right now, we're currently circulating a letter raising these concerns, and we'll be raising these concerns to the UK government, calling them to immediately halt all transfers of arms and military tech to Israel, and to publish details of any UK exports, including tech and software that is at the risk of being used in this manner in Israel's offensive in Gaza. And also just to explain what measures are being made to ensure that the UK is not complicit through data sharing or otherwise in this AI-driven targeting system. And of course, calling on the UK to support numerous calls for an immediate ceasefire, and to support work for a legally binding treaty that would regulate autonomous weapon systems.
Right.
But of course, these are concerns, as I was saying earlier, that we're seeing globally. There is not one lone conflict that I would pick out. There are several, and unless something is done, we'll continue to see this proliferate.
Right. Yeah, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about like the more solution-oriented approach and what can we do about this later on. Just going back to like this. Yeah, you mentioned lots of reasons in the sort of moral case against lethal autonomous weapons, and I might be missing out things you said here, but I think you talked about like bias, lack of accountability, and these sort of insurmountable human rights problems. Perhaps also a lack of robustness and potential harm to civilians, and also like these potential for destabilization. I guess on just honing in on the civilian harm point more closely, one argument I've heard a few times is like, which I guess only addresses one of these potential problems, is perhaps the claim that these killer robots might make war less brutal, and as AI becomes more capable, it will become better than humans at distinguishing between combatants and non-combatants. What do you think of that argument? And do you think the other harms from autonomous weapon systems still override that challenge, or this challenge holds in addition to these other ones too?
So the first question I would ask is less brutal for whom, really? This always comes back to the most powerful, right? So it's just whoever holds these weapons, those decisions are then initially in their hands. But then if you're considering if it is a truly lethal autonomous weapon system, machine learning, for example, what happens when that decision making is outside of a human's hands? We can't, it's kind of what we were discussing earlier. We don't know how this is going to go forward, but we can't safeguard in the same way that we can with humans, really. Also, the thing to note is these weapons will first and foremost be used in asymmetric warfare situations. So they will enable a more brutal and less humane form of slaughter for the weak. And another thing I would note is when we look at the use of AI in current conflicts, we can see that this argument about autonomous weapons making war less brutal, it doesn't stand up to scrutiny. So an investigation by Plus 927 has described the use of the increasingly integrated AI into the Israeli military's targeting systems as facilitating a mass assassination factory with a staggering loss of life. So as we speak right now, more than 30,000 people have been killed in Gaza. And part of that has been with the use of the IDF's Habsora AI system, which uses machine learning to generate recommended targets. And that has enabled a significant increase in the scale of attacks. And according to a former IDF chief of staff, AI target generation has enabled the IDF to shift from a more manual process where a machine produced one where a machine now produces about 100 targets in one day.
Right.
So AI generation may then explain why after 4 months they've not run out of targets. So then what you're seeing is just a rocket in the amount of deaths, right? So while there may be arguments made for a reduction in brutality, what we see in reality is not. It's not going to match that.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, just to, like, I'm pretty uncertain about this question. I'll admit I've not looked in it too deeply. I've not read this report, but my impression is that in Gaza, a lot of the civilian deaths are from like the increased use of like dumb missiles, and perhaps the problem is like actually a lack of precision AI enabled missiles. Yeah, I mean, as I say, I'm uncertain about this question, but maybe more relevant examples are like one that we had an AI debate at UCL about a week ago, and one person brought up this case of, and by the way, for audio, for listeners, I'd highly encourage you to listen to that episode. Yeah, but one example someone brought up was like this case in February where I think there was a Hezbollah commander who was killed in a drone attack, and I think, yeah, the warhead like was able to target a particular car. Would you say those? Yeah, would you like to? This is quite a long question. What would you think of that sort of general line of argument?
I think one thing to keep in mind is also the bias that is inherent in an AI, right?
Right.
And so there was actually this really useful. So Erin Hunt from Minds Action Canada has written extensively and talked extensively about human biases that are baked into algorithms and how that then informs how these weapons are going to behave. So one thing she said, and it's one thing I strongly agree with, is so it's 0.0004 of the global population has the access to the kind of education that is needed to create AI programming. So you have to be incredibly privileged to even be involved in this process to begin with. And just, I mean, if you sit with that number and think about it for a moment, I'm not really confident in then anything that then has that slim level, that level of privilege to be able to make that decision on who can take life away at the scale that we're talking about, and have that be. I think that will proliferate just a really kind of damaging scale of violence. And then what you're also removing from that is the morality, right? You're removing that thought of who is making that decision, because you can then step away and say it was the machine, it wasn't me. And another thing to note is, I think, so Wired did some research and found that only 12% of leading machine learning researchers were women. So autonomous weapons, they are going to then reinforce these really dangerous norms, right? So while you might be able to point to an example and then claim that, okay, it's making things, like it's targeting in exactly the way that you would hope. Although I will say I've not seen this clip, so I can't then speak to this this instance specifically. But inherent in this is, because of machine learning, because of the bias, there is a level of unpredictability, but also it's going to reinforce these really dangerous norms.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I guess like your point from before is like, even if these things are more precise, this could lead to more deaths in total, because the barriers to engaging in attacks is lower. And also, I guess another point, which is like, precision is just one of many ethical questions here. Also about like accountability and bias, which I think is like a very fair point. I guess this might be my last question, and before we move over to John, one thing I'm particularly interested in is like there seems to be a trend in AI development, as particularly in the last few years, that AI systems are becoming more capable and more general. And I wondered, how do you think these risks from lethal autonomous weapon systems might change over time as AI becomes more general and more capable?
I mean, I think that the fundamental underpinning of this remains the same, which is you are enabling increasingly sophisticated weapon systems to launch without human involvement in that decision making. Mm-hmm. And so the scale is what I would envision increasing, right? So what this could be applied to. And I think the other element that I would discuss here is the dual use of a lot of AI research. Yeah. So this is also kind of the situation that you and your fellow students are in, where you may be researching different forms of AI and kind of the practical aspects of that, and not necessarily be aware of how this could potentially be applied to weapon systems. So I think that's really going to be the thing that continues to escalate, is just without any form of regulation, how would you know that anything that you're working on won't... I mean, this has always been an age-old concern, though, right? Where you don't know down the line what the knock-on effect of your work will be. However, with this, the scale is so significant. And this is genuinely life or death, right? So it's... I think this is precisely why, I'll be honest, there's only so much I know. I've been working in this space for only a year or so, and so I'm still learning. But what I would say is just the reason why this is such an urgent issue, why this needs to be addressed now, is because otherwise we face an arms race. Otherwise we face all of these newer applications of AI just escalating conflict beyond what we've seen right now. And also, we're not just talking about conflict alone. We're talking about policing. We're talking about all these things just in our day-to-day life. So kind of actually one thing I would really suggest that you do is just keep asking questions, keep thinking about, okay, how is this about to be applied? And in terms of the urgency of this is something that I'm sure we'll speak about this more later on, but the Secretary General has kind of set a deadline, really, for when we urgently need a treaty that is regulating these weapons. And specifically, he's called for a treaty to be negotiated and kind of completed by 2026. So if you think about the kind of span of time that it requires to develop any kind of treaty, that's 2 years from now. That should kind of communicate how urgent this is. And he's not alone in calling for this, right? It's the kind of, yes, it's just we need to get on this, get on this now.
Yeah, I like fully with you on that. Seems like there's even some of the technology companies agree, and loads of prominent AI scientists too. So yeah, I think that kind of wraps up the first half of the conversation about what lethal autonomous weapon systems are and the case for doing something now is. So yeah, I guess I'll pass over to John to talk about more policy and action relevant things.
Thank you, Charlie. So I think I'd like to begin by asking what is the current state in terms of international regulation? What has the UN done so far? What are bilateral talks or multilateral talks between countries looking like? Is it looking positive? Is it looking negative? What's your take?
Okay, that's a big question. So let's start with what is currently in place. So there are discussions on this in a couple of areas within the UN. So there's the Convention on Certain Weapons, that's called the CCW. And that, so since 2014, this issue on has there been kind of any regulation on autonomous weapon systems and what there should be has happened under these auspices of the CCW. And this body aims to ban or restrict the use of weapons which are considered excessively injurious or whose effects are indiscriminate. And we would argue that absolutely this falls into that category, right? Mm-hmm. What is something to note about the CCW is it has been described repeatedly as politically deadlocked. It's often the nature with spaces where you've got just states working in coalition. It's a difficult thing. So significantly, the House of Lords AI and Weapons Systems Committee, so it published this report last December, and in that report it acknowledged this deadlock and expressed surprise at the UK government arguing that we should continue to push in this space alone for any kind of regulation. Well, not regulation, even just discussion. Mm-hmm. That they argue that it should remain within the CCW, and this is something that will hold up any progress. Significantly, this House of Lords committee has made it clear that the UK cannot continue doing business as usual, and that it needs to get serious about its efforts to work with the international community on autonomous weapon systems regulation. So there is another space, though, where this is happening, which is at the UN General Assembly. And so that is obviously a key forum. There are 193 member states that each have an equal vote. Significantly, last year in November 2023, there was a resolution that was passed at the UN where states, they did two things. They agreed on this resolution that sets out that they're concerned about the risk that these weapons pose. So they reference, this was 164 states, and it includes the UK, the US, Australia, Korea, and France. And so those, I named those states specifically because they are also states that have been maybe pushing back, maybe involved in any kind of precursors to this weaponry. Mm-hmm. They voted at the General Assembly to adopt this resolution. It's the first ever resolution on autonomous weapons. And it stresses the urgent need for the international community to address the challenges and concerns raised by autonomous weapon systems. So I've got a bit of the resolution in front of me here. And so I'm just going to read out a little line that's, I think, quite key.
Go for it.
So it references the serious challenges and concerns that new technological applications in the military domain, including those related to AI and autonomy in weapon systems, raise from humanitarian, legal, security, tech, and ethical perspectives. So they're concerned about this in an array of areas and the knock-on effect that it would have. They are also raising concerns about the negative consequences, rather the possible negative consequences and impact of autonomous weapon systems on global security and regional and international security. So this is something that states have come together on. That's 164 states out of 193. So that is a significant number, and it includes states that are already advancing this tech themselves. So they all know, they are aware of the fact that this is a moment, right? This is a moment where we can actually make a difference before things fall out of our hands. I think what I would argue is a resolution like that at the GA, it makes it clear that we're at this space where political will on this issue is growing. And also, they're also incredibly aware of the risk of non-state actors advancing this weaponry. So I think this is also an issue where that will galvanize them further. Does that kind of cover what's currently going on?
That gives me a really good idea of what's going on in the United Nations right now. Thank you so much.
Great.
Um,
Oh, and one last, sorry,
oh
one
yeah, no
last thing to
worries.
note is that resolution actually includes in it the decision to discuss this issue further. So at the upcoming high level week of the General Assembly, so that's around the time where the next session comes into place. I believe they have decided to then bring this issue up again at the next General Assembly. And there is language in this quite massive report that the Secretary General of the UN put together that obviously sets out that deadline that I mentioned earlier, calling for negotiations to conclude on a treaty by 2026. And just references it throughout. So there will be several instances in the next 2 years where we can continue to push on this. We can be like, okay, you committed to this, and just push this issue forward. So we plan to continue pushing the UK on this. And I think this is also an opportunity for civil society to have a massive role. So one thing I would note is there are about 6 or 7 forms of weaponry that are now regulated. There are international treaties on them. So most recently being the TPNW, which is the nuclear ban. All of these milestones in arms control were achieved due to the urgent calls of civil society. So that means that you and I, we all have a part to play in advancing this work. And I think we have our window right now in which to do it.
Thank you. So before I move on to the campaign to stop killer robots actions on their own, I'd like to, I have a question that's kind of related to what Charlie was asking you about earlier. And so you mentioned that there were a really large number of member states that voted in favor of this resolution at the United Nations. Is it worth being worried about any notable votes against or abstentions? And, with the threat of an arms race hanging over it, is there a risk that countries that may have signed in favor of this or showed their support for this resolution to end up developing weapons out of fear that their opponents or potential opponents might get them? And what can be done about that? Is there anything that can be done about that?
That's a very big question. I think so. To speak to the states that haven't, so I will say this resolution was very much a first step. It's talking about discussing this issue and taking this issue seriously. So I would say with the 163, I will double check that breakdown, but I believe that one thing to note is that doesn't mean that the remaining 30 all voted against this resolution. Some of them will have abstained. Some of them will have not been in the room to then be counted.
I see.
I think really what I would do is look at those states and then say, okay, we just need to apply more pressure. That's the first instinct that I have. I think your next question on should we be concerned about these states developing weapons, I would note that the states that I listed as being included in signing onto this in the first place, they are all looking at AI and weaponry. So the reality is this is already being integrated into weapon systems and military operations, but the fact that the vast majority of states are concerned about this, being frank, they're not stupid, right? They know that this is not going to be remotely good for them to have these weapons go forward unregulated, especially as it's in the interest of the great powers, right, to look at this, because once this tech is accessible, we can't really envision what applications it would have beyond Like it's not just going to be the large states who are able to use this, although they are the ones that are developing it right now.
Yeah.
And so there is precedent for, I think there's a ban on laser weapons that was instituted before they were ever in use. And so very much that's the goal here as well, is to preemptively ban this, because it is in the best interest of all of the states, every member state, every country on this earth. It's in our best interest to regulate this now. And I think anyone who stops and thinks about it will come down on that side as well.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so now getting back to the campaign to stop killer robots specifically, could you give me a short overview, because you've covered a lot of it already? What is the campaign to stop killer robots' position on regulating lethal autonomous weapons system internationally? And is this focusing more on deployment, on development, or perhaps both?
Yeah, so to try and keep it as brief as possible, the UK campaign to stop killer robots, first and foremost, advocates for an international legal treaty that would firstly prohibit the development and use of autonomous weapons that cannot be meaningfully controlled and those that target humans. And secondly, it would regulate those other autonomous weapons to ensure that meaningful human control is in place over the use of force. That's,
fantastic.
Short cover.
Amazing. Thank you. So what actionable steps do you think would be ideal, like in an ideal world would happen, as opposed to what actions do you think are actually reasonable? And so what path is campaign to stop killer robots trying to take in terms of like the tangible actions that they're taking?
Okay, so the first thing to say is UNA UK is on the steering committee for the UK campaign to stop killer robots, and essentially what that means is we are one of many members of the campaign, the global campaign, who are based here in the UK.
Yeah.
So I can speak specifically to what the UK campaign is working on. I can, to an extent, break down what the global campaign is looking at. And it's kind of what we've discussed already. So I'll keep it very brief on the global campaign and then focusing on the UK. Does
Fantastic. That sounds great.
Fantastic. Okay, so with the global campaign, a lot of that focus will be on advancing this through the UN. So a great deal of campaigning happened in the lead up to that resolution that was passed last year. And a lot more will continue forward in advance of the subsequent resolutions that we are hoping will be put forward, right? And that includes campaigning in each and every state. There's the UK campaign, there will be one in every single state. And so they will all be pushing this issue forward. Here in the UK, what that means is a whole range of things. So we undertake research. For example, the university's report that we discussed, that was published in 2022 and was examining the way that public funding is being used to fund research at universities, at public bodies, and how this might be used for kind of military applications. So that's something that we are scrutinising. The other thing that we at the UK campaign are doing, so we fed into this inquiry that the House of Lords did last year. And so a lot of their findings are then including concerns that we have raised in terms of what the UK's policies are on AI and just anything to do with the risks of AWS being developed. So the one thing that we are particularly noting is that while the UK government maintains that it doesn't possess fully autonomous weapon systems and it claims it has no intention of developing them, the Ministry of Defence is pursuing research and work in all of the 3 key disciplines that are underpinning autonomous weapons tech. So that's computer science, that's robotics, and that's sensors. And so they're also undertaking research into tech that would support the development of armed autonomous drones. So while none of their current projects are intended to develop lethal autonomous weapon systems, you see that these projects, they represent developments into tech which could be combined with other systems in the future, and they would be the building blocks potentially of those weapon systems. So obviously we are scrutinizing that. There are kind of tangible things, so kind of speaking at these inquiries, raising the alarm on this issue. The main thing is informing people. So it's me talking to you, for example, and then you talking to everyone around you. That's part of it. The other thing, we have a network of parliamentary champions. And so that was, I believe, a couple of years ago now that was created. And what that is a cross-party group of parliamentarians who are raising this in Parliament. They are asking questions about what is happening on this issue, and making sure that it's not ignored whenever, discussions about AI are happening. So, for example, I'm sure you saw that last year at the General Assembly, the UK's speeches were very much focused on AI. And so it's just important that if we're having conversations about leading on AI, we absolutely then should be leading on the regulation of this. This is something that this country has quite a history of actually being very supportive of treaties in terms of arms control. And I think this is one where we're just engaging positively at the UN in general, right? So this is because there are certain elements of arms control, given, for example, the nuclear ban, they are obviously not engaging on, which is incredibly frustrating. But that notwithstanding, this is an opportunity for the UK to lead. This is an opportunity to kind of engage positively on this issue, and it will only be to the good of us all. And so essentially that's what we're doing. We're getting into rooms and we're calling for this. And in terms of tangible things that we can all do, so I think this is something you might be familiar with already, but we are calling, the UK campaign is calling for public bodies to sign the Future of Life Pledge. And so that pledge calls for strong international norms, regulations and laws against lethal autonomous weapons. And for these public bodies to regularly and transparently report on research programs to prevent dual use risks. So that's one element. There's also kind of a petition that the global campaign has that I encourage you to sign if you haven't already. I encourage you to get your friends to sign it. And really, it's just about raising your voice on this. I don't know about you, but I often find when I talk about this issue with my peers, with my friends, they often go, "Oh God, this is something that I've not really had to think about very much, but now it's quite terrifying." And I think it's just, if we are informed on this issue, if we are all speaking up on it, we can drive really significant change. And that's really all the campaign is here to do, is to facilitate that.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And so in regards to like staying informed and driving change, and I know we're reaching the end of our time, but when I had a look at your at the report by the UNA UK, I noticed that there's a significant investigation into how UK universities have been involved in the development of lethal autonomous weapon systems. And so remaining on the topic of change, how have they been involved in this development? And, what can we as students do to demand better from them? And what steps could anyone listening to this podcast take to support this cause?
Yeah, that's a really important question. I think, so one thing, I'm just going to, context for listeners, if they've not read this report, I will specify it focuses on autonomous weapon systems rather than lethal autonomous weapon systems. It's an important distinction to make. This is still obviously research. It's not solely on lethal autonomous weapons. But so the UK campaign, this is UNA UK fed into this along with other members of the UK campaign to stop killer robots.
Yeah.
Facilitated this investigation in 2022 where it examined 13 institutions, including UCL, that have received significant, that have seen, for those of you who are listening, there was a fun little reaction from both Charlie and Joe on the cameras. Oh, that's brilliant.
We were sort of a mock celebration.
What
when
is
you
a
said
brilliant
that.
is, yeah, this is very much ironic, of course.
Glad to hear we're represented.
But so this study examined 13 institutions, including UCL, that have received significant funding from the UK's Ministry of Defence and that have links with the developers of technology that is relevant to AWS. So in much the way I was speaking earlier about tech, that is, it's not yet being applied in this way, but it absolutely could be. And these developers are, typically UK-based military or arms manufacturers. So we know that this is really how it would be applied. And we found 65 research programs whose outputs are at risk of either being incorporated into AWS or facilitating their development, even if indirectly. And the reason it could be indirectly is because of that dual use of technology. We can't yet know. Or while you're getting into this, you don't necessarily know how it's going to be applied, but we have assessed that risk and found that there is a credible risk right there. And also more broadly, the investigation found this disturbingly close relationship between the defence sector and UK universities. Here is the point where I think students can come in. So there are university ethics frameworks that have to be set out. And these often have contradictions within them. They are inadequate currently, so they aren't speaking to this rapidly developing tech. So there's this lack of safeguards for kind of end user and dual use risks associated with this technology, as well as a lack of transparency or accountability, or kind of ethical consideration around this research that students are undertaking. And so I think this comes down to a couple of things. This comes down to government funding is playing a role here, right? So I think it's the money is an issue, and I think that's more difficult to address. But as students, the lack of transparency is something that we can raise our voices about and be talking about. And so in terms of kind of a practical thing, I know it feels daunting, but as students, collectively, you have so much more power than you realize, right? So of course they have these ties and they have this funding stream, but funders are only interested because you are there, right? It's you as students are your university's most valuable resource. And so organizing collectively has had results before. So I would argue that a precedent for this is if you take, for example, the number of university divestment initiatives that have gone on to lead universities to divest from fossil fuels. So I think this simple kind of tangible thing you can do is push your institutions to sign the Future of Life Pledge, which calls upon governments and government leaders to create a future with strong international norms and regulations and laws against autonomous weapon systems. I can kind of set out a few other actions that I think you could take. Should I?
Yeah, go for it. Yes, please.
Great. Fantastic. Okay, so the other thing you could do is write to your MP. You can do a couple of things there. So I'll share across a link to where you can find out who your MP is if you're not certain, and just general tips and best practice for writing to your MP. But you can ask them to do two things. You can ask them to join the Parliamentary Champions for Action on Autonomous Weapon Systems. So that's that cross-party group. that I mentioned earlier. And it's so you don't need to be politically affiliated to any single party to do that. And so really all it is a cross-party group of parliamentarians and staff who are concerned about this growing autonomy in weapon systems. And the other thing you can do is just say, I'm concerned. I'm concerned about this development. I'm concerned that I'm in a school that is kind of not really looking into this in the way that it should be, and just pushing on them to increase their scrutiny on the situation. And also, finally, just keep asking questions. So I would encourage you to, I imagine you're friends with people who are working on computer science or working on areas that are deeply related to this AI.
And many of our...
ways that it could be applied.
Yeah, sorry to come in. And many of our listeners may be, part of the UCL AI Society, may be themselves involved in this research, or highly likely they'll know people who are doing related research. Yeah.
Yes. And so what I would encourage all of you to do is just think about how your research might be applied and what the knock-on effects might be. Just hold that thought in your mind and talk to your professors, talk to your tutors, ask them, have they considered the knock-on effects? Raise the fact that this report is out there. Say that you have a look, read the introduction at the very least. That's quite a good primer for what the main concerns are. And then tell them, okay, what are we doing to address this? It's been 2 years. UCL, what are you doing to address this? I think that's one thing you can do, because this is an issue that will have kind of global impact, and we can all play our part. So for us, it's obviously pushing for proper regulation and a ban, and for you, it's interrogating how your work might be used. I think just be a bit of a roadblock. Don't be afraid to just ask those questions. I know it might be uncomfortable at times, but yeah, especially collectively. I think all of you, I don't know how large the AI Society is, but I imagine there are enough of you to make quite a bit of noise. And so I just strongly encourage you to do that.
All right. Thank you so much. I think that wraps up my line of questioning. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, I just echo the same thing. Thanks so much, Rianna. I've learned loads from this conversation. I feel like it's also been nice, like, not to just focus on, these are all of the things that are wrong with the world, but also to, like, dedicate time and attention to what we can actually do to make a change. That was really refreshing. Yeah. So thank you.
It's my pleasure. It's been fantastic talking to you both. And I look forward to hearing about what you do to join us in this fight.
Okay. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
All right, fantastic.
Take care. Bye-bye.